I'm going to cool him off." "Victoria?" Chen whispered into the cockpit intercom, her voice dripping with malice as she stared at the sleeping baby in seat 4A. "Maybe spill a little something." "Oops. Clumsy me. That usually shuts them up." The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced the darkness at 4:30 a.m., but Jerome Washington was already awake, staring at the ceiling of his empty bedroom. 6 months had passed since the funeral, since he'd stood graveside holding his newborn son while dirt fell onto his wife's casket, and still sleep came in fragments. The grief counselor said it would get easier, but she hadn't mentioned how the silence of an empty house could feel louder than screams. Jerome rolled over and looked at the baby monitor on his nightstand. Elijah was sleeping peacefully in the nursery down the hall, his tiny chest rising and falling with the rhythm that had become Jerome's entire world. At 6 months old, Elijah had his mother's eyes and his father's stubborn chin, though he'd never know the woman who'd died bringing him into this world. "Morning, little man," Jerome whispered as he padded barefoot to the nursery. The room still smelled faintly of the lavender candles his wife had burned while they painted these walls together back when they thought they had forever to figure out parenthood. Now Jerome was learning on the fly, Googling everything from diaper rash remedies to sleep schedules at 3 in the morning. Elijah stirred as Jerome lifted him from the crib, making the soft cooing sounds that never failed to melt his father's heart. "We've got a big day today, buddy," Jerome murmured, carrying his son to the changing table. "Daddy's got to go fight some bad guys in Chicago, and you get to come with me on your first airplane ride." The truth was more complicated than that. But how do you explain medical malpractice to a baby? How do you tell your son that the hospital's negligence killed his mother? That the same doctors who were supposed to save her had ignored her complaints of severe pain for hours, dismissing her as just another dramatic black woman? Jerome's jaw tightened as he thought about the case file sitting on his kitchen table, thick with expert testimony and evidence that would hopefully prevent other families from losing what he'd lost. As the lead attorney at Washington and Associates, Jerome had built his career on holding powerful institutions accountable for their failures. Hospitals that covered up medical errors, corporations that dumped toxic waste in poor neighborhoods, police departments that turned a blind eye to brutality. He'd taken them all on and won. His reputation as the lawyer who never backs down had made him wealthy and feared in equal measure. But all the courtroom victories in the world couldn't bring back the woman he'd loved since law school. Jerome heated a bottle while Elijah babbled happily in his bouncer seat, tiny hands reaching for the mobile of airplanes that hung overhead. His wife had picked it out during one of their weekend shopping trips, laughing as she spun the little planes and talked about all the places they'd take their child someday. "He's going to see the world," she'd said, resting her hands on her growing belly. "Our little boy is going to know that the sky isn't the limit. It's just the beginning." The memory hit Jerome like a physical blow, and he gripped the kitchen counter until his knuckles went white. Some mornings the grief ambushed him like this, turning ordinary moments into minefields of loss. He forced himself to breathe, to focus on the present, on the baby who needed him to be strong. By 6 a.m., Jerome had Elijah fed, changed, and packed for their trip to Chicago. The meeting with the medical board's attorneys was scheduled for tomorrow morning, and Jerome planned to present evidence so damning that settling out of court would be their only option. He'd already turned down their initial offer of $2 million. Not because the money wasn't substantial, but because money alone wouldn't prevent other women from dying the way his wife had died. As Jerome loaded the diaper bag into his BMW, he caught sight of his reflection in the car's window. At 36, he was still the same man who'd graduated summa cum laude from Howard Law School, but grief had carved new lines around his eyes and added gray threads to his close-cropped beard. He wore his success like armor now, the perfectly tailored suits, the expensive watch, the confident bearing that made opposing counsel nervous. But underneath it all, he was just a man trying to raise his son alone in a world that seemed determined to grind them both down. The drive to Detroit Metropolitan Airport took 45 minutes through morning traffic that gave Jerome too much time to think. He'd chosen to fly first class not because he needed the luxury, but because the extra space would make traveling with Elijah easier. The baby carrier was already loaded with bottles, diapers, toys, and a folder of legal documents that would hopefully deliver the justice his wife deserved. "You ready for this little man?" Jerome asked as he lifted the baby carrier from the car. Elijah gurgled happily, completely unaware that this trip would mark the beginning of the most important case his father had ever fought. A case that would determine whether his mother's death meant something or was just another statistic in a broken medical system. Jerome straightened his shoulders and walked toward the terminal, carrying his son and his grief with equal determination. He had no way of knowing that in less than 4 hours both their lives would be forever changed by a woman whose own pain had twisted into something dark and dangerous. Someone who would see Jerome's success and Elijah's innocence as threats to be eliminated rather than lives to be respected. Victoria Chen stood in front of her bathroom mirror at 5:15 a.m. applying foundation with the precision of someone performing surgery. Each stroke of the makeup brush was deliberate, transforming her tired face into the mask of professional competence that had become her identity. At 48, Victoria had perfected the art of looking younger than her years, but the cracks were starting to show no matter how much concealer she used. The apartment around her reflected a life that had slowly come undone over the past 2 years. Designer furniture bought during her marriage sat next to discount store replacements, expensive artwork hanging beside empty spots where other pieces had been sold to pay bills. The divorce had taken half her savings, and her teenage daughter Madison's college fund had been decimated by legal fees and her ex-husband's deliberate financial sabotage. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from Madison. "Mom, I need money for textbooks. Dad says to ask you." The words stung because they were becoming routine. Her ex-husband using their daughter as a weapon in his ongoing campaign to make Victoria's life miserable. She typed back, "I'll transfer money tonight," even though her checking account was already running dangerously low. 22 years with Global Airways had given Victoria seniority and respect among the crew, but it had also trapped her in a job that paid well enough to keep her comfortable yet poorly enough to make her vulnerable. She couldn't afford to lose this position, couldn't risk the union protection that had shielded her from the complaints that occasionally surfaced about her treatment of certain passengers. Victoria had learned early in her career that the uniform gave her power that passengers would defer to her authority, even when they outranked her in every other aspect of life. The realization had been intoxicating for a woman who'd grown up powerless, whose own mother had cleaned houses for wealthy families, while Victoria watched from the kitchen doorway, invisible and unimportant. Now, as she pinned her wings to her blazer and checked her appearance one final time, Victoria felt the familiar surge of control that came with putting on her work persona. In this uniform, she wasn't Victoria the abandoned wife or Victoria the struggling single mother. She was Flight Attendant Chen, gatekeeper of the premium cabin guardian of first-class privilege. The drive to the airport took her through neighborhoods she'd once lived in, past the house where she'd raised Madison, and believed her marriage was solid. Her ex-husband still lived there with his 25-year-old secretary, the woman who'd destroyed Victoria's life with a smile and a pregnancy announcement that came 6 months after the divorce papers were signed. Victoria's hands tightened on the steering wheel as she thought about the alimony hearing scheduled for next month. Her lawyer had warned her that the payments might be reduced since her ex-husband was claiming financial hardship while simultaneously buying a new Porsche. The injustice of it made her stomach burn with acid that no amount of antacids could neutralize. At the crew briefing, Victoria took her usual seat at the front of the room, surveying the younger flight attendants with the critical eye of someone who'd earned her position through decades of service. Many of them were fresh out of training, all bright smiles and naive enthusiasm about serving passengers. They hadn't learned yet that the job was really about control, about maintaining order in a metal tube flying 30,000 feet above the ground. Today's flight to Chicago is full, announced Captain Mitchell, a veteran pilot whose gray hair and steady demeanor had always reminded Victoria of her father. "We've got several VIPs in first class, so let's make sure service is exceptional. Any issues, you come to me directly." Victoria nodded along with the others, but her mind was already cataloging the first-class passenger list. Business executives who expected to be treated like royalty celebrities, who demanded special attention, politicians who acted like they owned the airplane. She'd learned to manage them all with a combination of flattery and firm boundaries. What Victoria couldn't tolerate were the passengers who didn't understand the hierarchy, who acted entitled to first-class service without showing proper deference to her authority. She'd developed an instinct for spotting them during boarding. The way they held themselves, the expectation in their eyes, the assumption that they belonged in her domain without earning their place. These passengers needed to be taught respect, needed to understand that first class wasn't just about bigger seats and better food. It was about knowing your place in the natural order of things. Victoria had subtle ways of reminding them, small indignities that couldn't be easily reported, but left them understanding who really controlled their flying experience. As she prepared the first-class cabin for boarding, Victoria's phone chimed with another text from Madison. "Dad's new girlfriend is pregnant again. Thought you should know." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow, confirming what she'd suspected for weeks. Her replacement wasn't just younger and prettier, she was fertile in a way Victoria had never been able to be after Madison's difficult birth. Victoria's hands shook slightly as she arranged the pillows and blankets with mechanical precision. The unfairness of it all, her ex-husband starting fresh with a new family while she struggled to maintain the life they'd built together, felt like a weight pressing on her chest. But she couldn't afford to break down, couldn't let her personal problems interfere with the job that was now her only source of stability. The first passengers were already queuing at the gate, and Victoria could see them through the window of the jet bridge. She straightened her shoulders and checked her reflection in the galley mirror one final time. Whatever was happening in her personal life, she still commanded respect. In this uniform, still had the authority to make passengers' lives easier or more difficult, depending on how they treated her. Today, Victoria decided she would remind everyone exactly who was in charge of this cabin. The thought gave her a small measure of comfort, a sense of control that had been missing from every other aspect of her life. She had no idea that in less than 3 hours this need for control would lead her to make a choice that would destroy everything she thought she was protecting. Patricia Evans had learned long ago that the best way to observe human behavior was to become invisible, and at 58 she had perfected the art of blending into the background. Dressed in a simple gray cardigan and carrying a worn paperback novel, she looked like any other grandmother traveling to visit family. No one would guess that she was a senior inspector for the Federal Aviation Administration, armed with recording equipment and 2 decades of experience investigating airline safety violations. This undercover audit of Global Airways Flight 847 was Patricia's third. This month part of an ongoing investigation into passenger complaints that had been steadily increasing over the past year. The pattern was subtle but concerning. Reports of discriminatory treatment, excessive force in handling passenger disputes, and a corporate culture that seemed to prioritize crew authority over passenger safety and dignity. Patricia had seen it all during her career with the FAA, from drunk pilots to flight attendants who smuggled drugs in coffee thermoses. But the cases that haunted her most were the ones involving abuse of power, where crew members used their authority to humiliate or harm passengers who couldn't fight back. These incidents rarely made headlines, buried under layers of corporate legal protection and union contracts that made prosecution nearly impossible. Her own motivation for this work ran deeper than professional duty. 23 years ago, Patricia's younger brother had died in a plane crash that investigators later determined was preventable. A series of small safety violations and procedural shortcuts had accumulated into catastrophic failure, but by the time anyone was held accountable, her brother was already buried and the families were left with settlement checks that could never bring back what they'd lost. Since then, Patricia had made it her mission to catch problems before they became tragedies, to document the kind of negligence and malice that thrived in the shadows of regulatory oversight. She'd testified in dozens of cases, her meticulous reports serving as evidence in lawsuits that had resulted in millions of dollars in settlements and, more importantly, changes in policies that protected future passengers. The small recording device in her purse was state-of-the-art, capable of capturing both audio and video with crystal clarity while appearing to be nothing more than a smartphone. Patricia had learned to operate it without looking, positioning it at angles that would provide maximum coverage while maintaining her cover as an ordinary passenger. As she settled into seat 4B, Patricia immediately began her assessment of the cabin crew. Flight Attendant Chen moved with the kind of rigid precision that suggested someone compensating for inner turmoil, her smile never quite reaching her eyes as she greeted boarding passengers. Patricia had seen this type before. Crew members who used their authority as a weapon, who found ways to punish passengers for perceived slights or social transgressions. The subtle signs were there for anyone trained to recognize them, the way Chen's posture changed when addressing different passengers, the micro-expressions of judgment that flickered across her face, the territorial manner in which she arranged her workspace. Patricia discreetly activated her recording device and began documenting what she observed, knowing that pattern evidence would be crucial if formal charges were eventually filed. When Jerome Washington boarded with his infant son, Patricia's professional instincts immediately went on high alert. She watched Chen's reaction to the father-baby pair, noting the subtle shift in the flight attendant's demeanor that suggested trouble ahead. The way Chen's eyes lingered on Jerome, the almost imperceptible tightening around her mouth, the deliberate delay in offering assistance. All red flags that Patricia had learned to recognize. Patricia had investigated enough discrimination cases to understand the dangerous dynamics at play. A black man in first class with an infant was already challenging certain passengers' assumptions about who belonged in premium seating. Adding a flight attendant who seemed predisposed to view him as a problem was a recipe for confrontation that could escalate quickly beyond verbal disagreement. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Patricia positioned her recording device to capture maximum coverage of the interaction between Chen and the Washington family. Her trained eye caught details that ordinary passengers might miss. The way Chen's body language became more aggressive when addressing Jerome, the subtle intimidation tactics disguised as safety procedures, the building tension that suggested an incident was inevitable. Patricia's job required her to remain neutral, to observe and document without intervention unless passenger safety was immediately threatened. It was one of the hardest aspects of undercover work, watching situations develop that she knew would end badly while being unable to prevent them without blowing her cover and compromising the investigation. She'd learned to compartmentalize her emotions, to focus on gathering evidence that could prevent future incidents rather than stopping the current one. But there was something about the sleeping baby in the carrier next to her that made maintaining professional distance more difficult than usual. Perhaps it was the protective way his father held him, or the innocent vulnerability of a child who had no idea he was about to become a victim. Patricia had investigated cases involving children before incidents where crew members had targeted families as a way of asserting dominance over passengers they viewed as disruptive. The psychological profiles were disturbingly consistent. Individuals who felt powerless in their personal lives but had discovered they could exercise control in the confined space of an aircraft cabin. As Flight 847 reached cruising altitude and the beverage service began, Patricia kept her recording device active and her attention focused on Chen's movements. Every instinct developed over 2 decades of investigation told her that something significant was about to happen, that the careful documentation she was gathering would soon become evidence in a case that would extend far beyond this single flight. She had no idea that within the next hour she would witness an assault so brazen and cruel that it would challenge everything she thought she knew about the depths of human malice, or that her presence on this flight would be the only thing standing between a grieving father and a justice system that too often protected the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. Detroit Metropolitan Airport hummed with the controlled chaos of morning departures as Jerome Washington made his way through the terminal, Elijah sleeping peacefully in his carrier. The baby had taken his bottle without fussing and seemed unfazed by the unfamiliar sights and sounds around him, a small mercy that Jerome hoped would continue throughout their journey. The first-class check-in counter was mercifully empty, allowing Jerome to complete the process quickly while keeping Elijah undisturbed. He'd chosen Global Airways partly for their reputation for family-friendly service, and partly because their first-class seats were wider than other airlines, providing more space for the baby carrier and all the supplies that traveling with an infant required. Flying alone with the little one today, asked the check-in agent, a middle-aged woman whose genuine smile suggested she had children or grandchildren of her own. Her tone was warm and helpful, the kind of customer service that made Jerome feel optimistic about the flight ahead. "First trip together," Jerome replied gently, adjusting the carrier strap, hoping he's as good a traveler as his mama was. The reference to his wife slipped out naturally, the way it still did sometimes when he forgot for a moment that she was gone. The pain was softer now than it had been 6 months ago, but it still caught him off guard at unexpected moments. The agent printed their boarding passes and attached the priority tags that would ensure their luggage was handled first. "You're in 4A, perfect for traveling with a baby. Window seat so you won't be disturbed by other passengers moving around, and plenty of space for all your gear. Have a wonderful flight." Jerome thanked her and made his way toward security, navigating the crowds with the careful attention of someone carrying precious cargo. Other travelers seemed to move around him instinctively, most people naturally giving space to a man with an infant. It was one of the few times Jerome felt like his race faded into the background, replaced by the universal recognition of a parent managing a small child. The security checkpoint went smoothly despite the extra screening required for baby formula and supplies. The TSA agents were professional and efficient, even offering to help Jerome repack the diaper bag after inspection. It was exactly the kind of routine travel experience Jerome had hoped for, setting a positive tone for what he knew would be an emotionally difficult trip. At the gate, Jerome found a quiet corner where he could set up a temporary base camp with all of Elijah's supplies within easy reach. The baby was still sleeping, which meant Jerome could review his case notes one more time before boarding. The medical malpractice lawsuit against Detroit General Hospital was the most important case of his career, not just because of the potential settlement amount, but because proving negligence in his wife's death might save other women from suffering the same fate. The boarding announcement came at exactly 9:30, and Jerome gathered their belongings with practiced efficiency. He'd learned in the past 6 months that traveling with a baby required military-level planning and preparation, but it was getting easier as he developed routines and systems that worked. Walking down the jet bridge, Jerome felt a familiar tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with claustrophobia or fear of flying. Air travel had become a reminder of all the trips he'd planned to take with his wife, all the family vacations that would never happen. But he pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the present, on getting himself and Elijah safely to Chicago. The first-class cabin of the Boeing 757 was configured with 8 seats in a 2-2 layout, spacious and comfortable, with the kind of amenities that made long flights bearable. Jerome's seat was on the left side of the aircraft, next to the window, as promised, with enough room to keep the baby carrier secure during takeoff and landing. As Jerome approached row 4, he noticed a woman already seated in 4B, an older passenger reading what appeared to be a murder mystery. She looked up briefly as he approached, offering a polite smile before returning to her book. The interaction was pleasant and unremarkable, exactly what Jerome hoped for from his seatmate. Flight Attendant Chen appeared as Jerome was settling Elijah into the space beside his seat, her approach so sudden and aggressive that it immediately put him on guard. Her first words weren't a greeting or offer of assistance, but a demand to see his boarding pass, despite the fact that he was obviously a first-class passenger with an infant who clearly belonged in the premium cabin. "Excuse me, sir. I need to verify your seat assignment before you get settled," Chen said, her tone suggesting she expected to find some kind of discrepancy. She stood in the aisle with her hands on her hips, blocking other passengers who were trying to board while making it clear she had no intention of moving until Jerome complied. Jerome felt the familiar weight of being presumed guilty until proven innocent, the exhausting reality of having his right to occupy certain spaces constantly questioned. But he also recognized that reacting with anything other than calm compliance would likely escalate the situation, especially with his infant son present. "Of course," Jerome replied evenly, pulling out his phone to display his boarding pass. The screen clearly showed Seat 4A, purchased weeks in advance and paid for in full. There was no possible confusion about his right to be there, which made Chen's demand feel like harassment disguised as procedure. Chen barely glanced at the boarding pass before stepping aside with obvious reluctance, but not before making a comment about keeping noise levels down that was clearly directed at Elijah, despite the fact that the baby hadn't made a sound since boarding. The woman in 4B looked up from her book again, this time with an expression of concern that suggested she'd witnessed enough of the interaction to recognize it as problematic. She caught Jerome's eye and offered a subtle shake of her head that seemed to communicate solidarity, a small gesture that Jerome appreciated more than she could know. As Jerome continued organizing their supplies for the flight, he became aware that other first-class passengers were watching the interaction with varying degrees of interest and discomfort. Some seemed sympathetic to his position, while others appeared to support Chen's aggressive verification of his credentials. The dynamic was depressingly familiar. A black man forced to prove he belonged in a space that his white counterparts could occupy without question. Chen returned to the galley but remained visible through the open curtain, her attention focused on row 4 in a way that felt more like surveillance than customer service. Jerome settled Elijah more securely in his carrier and tried to ignore the sensation of being watched, hoping that the flight attendant's initial hostility was just an unfortunate first impression rather than a preview of problems to come. The captain's voice came over the intercom, welcoming passengers aboard and announcing an on-time departure for Chicago. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate and began taxiing toward the runway, Jerome looked out the window at the Detroit skyline and wondered if he'd made a mistake choosing this flight. Something about Chen's attitude suggested that the next 3 hours might be more challenging than he'd anticipated, but it was too late to change his mind now. As Flight 847 climbed into the morning sky above Detroit, the cabin pressure changes that accompany takeoff began affecting Elijah exactly as Jerome had feared they might. The baby stirred in his carrier, his tiny face scrunching up in obvious discomfort as his ears popped and adjusted to the altitude change. Jerome immediately began the soothing routine he'd perfected over months of practice. Gentle rocking, soft humming, and quiet words of comfort that had always calmed his son before. "I know, buddy. I know it hurts, Jerome," whispered, carefully lifting Elijah from the carrier to hold him upright against his chest. The position helped equalize pressure in the baby's ears, while providing the skin-to-skin contact that pediatricians recommended for calming distressed infants. "It'll pass in just a minute and then we'll be flying smooth." Elijah's cries were soft at first, more like whimpers than the full-throated wails that could wake an entire household at 3 a.m. Jerome had become expert at reading his son's different cries: hunger, fatigue, discomfort, and the particular sound he was making now that indicated ear pressure pain. Most experienced travelers understood that babies crying during takeoff and landing was normal, even inevitable. But Jerome was acutely aware that not everyone would be sympathetic. The woman in 4B, Patricia, he'd learned during boarding, looked over with understanding rather than annoyance, her expression suggesting she'd raised children of her own and remembered this phase of air travel. "Poor little thing," she murmured. "How old is he?" 6 months. Jerome replied, continuing to rock Elijah gently while monitoring the other passengers' reactions. Most seemed tolerant or simply indifferent, focused on their own activities as the plane continued its climb. But he could feel Victoria Chen's attention like a laser beam focused on their row, her disapproval radiating from the galley where she was securing equipment for flight. Within minutes, Elijah's discomfort began to ease as his ears adjusted to the cabin pressure. His cries gradually subsided into hiccups and then peaceful silence as Jerome continued holding him upright, patting his back in the rhythmic pattern that had never failed to work. The crisis had passed exactly as Jerome knew it would, but the damage to Chen's perception of them as disruptive passengers was already done. "Much better," Patricia observed quietly, returning to her book as Elijah settled back into peaceful sleep. "You're a natural at this." Jerome smiled at the compliment while carefully transferring Elijah back to his carrier, making sure the baby was secure and comfortable before fastening his own seatbelt as the captain turned off the fasten seatbelt sign. The worst part of flying with an infant was over, and Jerome felt optimistic that the rest of the flight would proceed without incident. That optimism lasted exactly 12 minutes. Victoria Chen emerged from the galley with the purposeful stride of someone on a mission, her destination clearly row 4. She stopped directly beside Jerome's seat, close enough that her presence felt invasive and intimidating rather than professional. "Sir, I need to remind you that first-class passengers pay premium prices for a quiet, peaceful environment," Chen said, her voice pitched just loud enough for other passengers to hear. "If your child continues to be disruptive, I'll have to ask you to move to the back of the aircraft where crying babies are more appropriate." The threat was delivered with the kind of bureaucratic authority that made it sound like official airline policy. But Jerome knew better. He'd flown first class dozens of times with his wife, and they'd never been treated this way despite occasional infant passengers in the premium cabin. This was personal harassment disguised as procedure. "My son was crying for less than 5 minutes during takeoff due to ear pressure," Jerome replied calmly, keeping his voice low to avoid disturbing other passengers. "That's completely normal for infants during altitude changes, and he's been quiet since then." Chen's expression hardened at being corrected, her authority challenged by someone she clearly expected to defer to her demands. "I don't care what's normal, sir. I care about maintaining the premium experience that first-class passengers expect. If you can't control your child, you don't belong up here." The words hung in the air like a gauntlet, thrown down, their implication clear to everyone within hearing range. Chen wasn't just talking about noise management. She was questioning Jerome's right to occupy first-class space, suggesting that he and his son were inherently incompatible with the elevated environment they'd paid to access. Patricia Evans looked up sharply from her book, her expression shifting from polite interest to professional concern as she recognized the discriminatory undertones in Chen's remarks. Other passengers were starting to pay attention as well, some looking uncomfortable with the confrontation, while others seemed to support Chen's position. "Ma'am, with respect, we have as much right to be here as any other ticketed passengers," Jerome said, his legal training helping him maintain composure despite the provocation. "My son is an infant, not a disruptive passenger, and I'm handling his needs appropriately. If you have specific concerns about airline policy, I'd be happy to discuss them with your supervisor." The mention of involving management seemed to escalate Chen's agitation rather than diffusing it. She took a step closer to Jerome's seat, her body language becoming more aggressive as she realized she couldn't intimidate him into compliance. "I am the supervisor in this cabin," Chen snapped, abandoning any pretense of professional courtesy. "And I'm telling you that if that baby makes another sound, you're going to the back of the plane where you belong. This isn't a nursery, and I won't tolerate passengers who think they can disrupt everyone else's flight just because they bought an expensive ticket." The confrontation had escalated beyond reasonable passenger service into something darker and more personal. Jerome felt the familiar weight of being forced to prove his worthiness to occupy space that should be his by right. The exhausting burden of having to justify his presence to authority figures who had already decided he didn't belong. But Jerome Washington hadn't built his career by backing down from bullies, and he wasn't about to start now. He looked Chen directly in the eye, his voice remaining calm, but carrying an undertone of steel that made his courtroom reputation. "Ma'am, you might want to reconsider your approach here," Jerome said quietly, "because you have no idea who you're dealing with, and this conversation is being witnessed by a lot of people who can verify exactly what's being said." Chen's face flushed with anger at the subtle threat, but before she could respond, the captain's voice came over the intercom announcing that the beverage service would begin shortly. She shot Jerome a look of pure malice before stalking back to the galley, leaving behind an atmosphere thick with tension and the promise of worse to come. The beverage service began 40 minutes into the flight with Victoria Chen wheeling the first-class cart down the aisle with the mechanical precision of someone who had performed this routine thousands of times. But today there was something different in her movements, a barely contained energy that suggested she was operating on a frequency just slightly off from normal professional behavior. Jerome watched her approach through his peripheral vision while pretending to read legal documents on his tablet. Elijah had been sleeping peacefully for the past half hour, exhausted by his earlier crying episode and lulled by the steady hum of the aircraft engines. Jerome had positioned himself protectively around the baby carrier, one hand resting lightly on Elijah's chest to feel the reassuring rhythm of his breathing. Chen worked her way methodically through the first few rows, her interactions with other passengers notably different from her treatment of Jerome. She was all smiles and professional courtesy, with the business executive in 1A offering him choice of beverages and extra snacks without being asked. The elderly couple in 2C received warm attention and patient explanations of the available options. Even the obvious tourist family in 3B was treated with standard airline politeness. But as Chen approached row 4, her entire demeanor shifted. The smile disappeared, replaced by an expression of cold determination that made Patricia Evans look up from her book with renewed concern. There was something predatory in the flight attendant's approach, as if she were stalking prey rather than serving customers. "What can I get for you?" Chen asked Patricia, her tone returning to professional neutrality as she deliberately positioned herself with her back to Jerome. The cart blocked the aisle, trapping Jerome in his window seat, while Chen conducted her business as if he didn't exist. Patricia ordered water with a polite smile, but her attention remained focused on Chen's body language and the obvious slight being directed at Jerome. As a federal investigator, Patricia had witnessed enough discriminatory behavior to recognize the pattern. The deliberate exclusion, the subtle humiliation tactics, the abuse of positional authority to punish someone for perceived infractions. Chen served Patricia's water with exaggerated care before finally turning to acknowledge Jerome's presence, her expression shifting back to barely concealed hostility. She let several seconds pass in silence, forcing Jerome to initiate the interaction rather than offering service as she had to other passengers. "Could I get a coffee, please?" Jerome asked politely, his voice carefully modulated to avoid any tone that could be interpreted as demanding or aggressive. "Black, no sugar." Chen's response was to let out an audible sigh and roll her eyes in a gesture so dramatic that several passengers turned to look. "Coffee," she repeated, as if the request were somehow unreasonable, despite coffee being the most common beverage served on flights. "Fine." She turned to the cart with unnecessary force, her movements sharp and aggressive as she selected a ceramic mug from the first-class service set. The coffee pot contained freshly brewed liquid maintained at the optimal serving temperature of 195 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to deliver the perfect cup, but also hot enough to cause severe burns if mishandled. What happened next would later be analyzed frame by frame in legal depositions and federal investigations, but in real time it unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a car accident happening in slow motion. Chen lifted the thermal carafe, positioning it over the mug she'd placed on top of the beverage cart. But instead of pouring carefully into the cup, she tilted the container at an angle that suggested either profound incompetence or deliberate malice. The aircraft hit a patch of minor turbulence at that exact moment, nothing more than the gentle buffeting that occurs dozens of times during any flight barely noticeable to experienced travelers. But Chen used the slight movement of the plane as cover for what she did next, allowing the carafe to tip forward aggressively, while she stared directly at Jerome rather than watching where she was pouring. Patricia Evans, whose investigative instincts had been on high alert throughout the interaction, had already activated her recording device and captured every second of what transpired. The video would later show clearly that Chen had multiple opportunities to correct her aim, multiple chances to prevent what was about to happen, but instead chose to let the stream of scalding coffee miss its intended target entirely. The dark liquid arced through the air in a perfect parabola, bypassing the mug completely and splashing directly onto Jerome's chest, and more horrifically onto the left side of Elijah's carrier, where the baby's tiny arm was exposed. The coffee, heated to nearly 200 degrees, made contact with the infant's delicate skin, with a sound that would haunt Jerome's dreams for years to come, a soft hissing like bacon hitting a hot pan. Elijah's scream cut through the cabin like a siren, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that seemed to pierce every passenger's soul simultaneously. Jerome's own roar of pain and fury followed immediately after, as the scalding liquid soaked through his dress shirt and began burning his chest. But his father's instincts overrode his own suffering as he frantically worked to free his son from the coffee-soaked carrier. My baby Jerome shouted, his hands shaking as he struggled with the carrier straps, while hot coffee continued to drip from the fabric onto Elijah's skin. "You burned my baby. Get me ice. Get help now." The cabin erupted into chaos. Passengers in nearby seats leaped to their feet, some pulling out phones to record, while others simply stared in shock at the unfolding scene. A woman in 2A screamed and covered her mouth with her hands. The businessman in 1A stood up to get a better view, his expression shifting from annoyance to horror as he realized what had happened. Patricia Evans was already moving before Jerome finished speaking, reaching into her purse for the emergency first aid supplies she carried as part of her federal inspector kit, while simultaneously ensuring her recording device captured every second of Chen's response to the crisis she had created. But instead of rushing to help the injured infant, instead of calling for medical assistance or ICE or any of the emergency protocols that flight attendants are trained to implement in such situations, Victoria Chen stood frozen with the coffee carafe still in her hands, her face cycling through a rapid sequence of emotions. Shock, fear, and then something that looked disturbingly like satisfaction. "Well, you shouldn't have moved," Chen said finally, her voice cutting through Elijah's screams with chilling calmness. "You bumped the cart. I didn't touch anything. This is your fault." The words landed like physical blows on everyone who heard them. Even passengers predisposed to support airline crew authority found themselves staring at Chen in disbelief. The baby's screams continued to fill the cabin while hot coffee soaked deeper into his clothing and Jerome struggled desperately to strip away the scalded fabric. "I never touched your cart," Jerome shouted back, finally freeing Elijah from the carrier and cradling the screaming infant against his chest. He could see the bright red burns already forming on his son's left arm and shoulder, the delicate skin already blistering from contact with liquid hot enough to brew coffee. "He's burned. Get me ice. Get a medical kit now." But Chen made no move toward the galley where medical supplies were stored. Instead, she straightened her uniform jacket and looked down at Jerome with an expression of cold disdain that would be preserved forever in Patricia's recording. "Lower your voice," Chen commanded, as if volume control were more important than medical attention for an injured baby. "You are being aggressive. You are scaring the other passengers. If you don't calm down immediately, I will have the captain turn this plane around." and have you arrested for interfering with flight operations." The threat was so outrageous, so completely disconnected from reality that several passengers gasped audibly. Jerome stared at Chen in complete disbelief, his son's screams of pain filling his ears while this woman threatened to have him arrested for being the victim of her assault. Patricia Evans stepped into the aisle, her federal credentials giving her authority that superseded Chen's airline position. "Ma'am, step back immediately." Patricia ordered, her voice carrying 20 years of law enforcement experience. "This infant needs immediate medical attention, and you are interfering with emergency care." But Chen's response would prove to be the final nail in her professional coffin, the moment that transformed this incident from potential accident to undeniable criminal assault. She looked at Patricia with the same contempt she'd shown Jerome and delivered the words that would end her career and destroy her life. "I don't care who you think you are. Sit down and mind your own business, or I'll have you arrested too." The aftermath of the scalding coffee assault unfolded like a masterclass in how institutional authority can be weaponized against victims, with Victoria Chen demonstrating the calculated cruelty that had likely defined her interactions with vulnerable passengers for years. Rather than showing any remorse for burning an infant, Chen immediately pivoted to damage control mode, working to establish a narrative that would protect her career and shift blame onto Jerome. Chen's first move was to grab the communication handset mounted near the galley, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency as she dialed the cockpit. Her voice, when she spoke to Captain Morrison, carried none of the hostility she'd shown passengers, instead adopting the tone of a professional reporting an emergency situation. "Captain, this is Victoria. We have a serious situation in first class. The passenger in 4A became violent during beverage service. He struck the coffee cart and caused a spill that injured his infant. He's now threatening crew members and disrupting the cabin. I need you to radio ahead for police assistance and consider emergency landing options." The lies flowed from Chen's lips with disturbing fluency, each fabrication carefully crafted to paint Jerome as the aggressor and herself as the victim of passenger violence. From her position in row 4, Patricia could hear every word despite Chen's attempt to speak quietly, and her recording device captured the entire false report for future evidence. Jerome, meanwhile, was focused entirely on his son's injuries, using napkins from the beverage cart to gently blot scalding coffee from Elijah's burned skin while trying to assess the extent of the damage. The baby's left arm and shoulder showed clear signs of second-degree burns, the skin already bright red and beginning to blister in several places. "I need ice," Jerome called out to anyone who would listen, "and burn gel if you have it." "This is serious." Several passengers tried to help, offering water bottles and asking crew members for medical supplies, but Chen had positioned herself to block access to the galley where first aid equipment was stored. When a younger flight attendant named Sarah attempted to retrieve the medical kit, Chen intercepted her with sharp words about protocol and authority. "Nobody touches medical supplies without my authorization." Chen snapped at Sarah, whose face showed genuine distress at the baby's continued screams. "And I'm not authorizing anything until we determine what really happened here." Patricia Evans had seen enough. Rising from her seat with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command situations, she approached Chen, directly pulling her federal credentials from her purse as she moved. "Flight Attendant Chen, I am Special Agent Patricia Evans with the Federal Aviation Administration." Patricia announced, her voice carrying through the first-class cabin with unmistakable authority. "You will immediately provide medical assistance to that injured infant, and you will stop interfering with emergency care." The revelation that a federal inspector was on board and had witnessed everything sent shockwaves through the cabin. Other passengers leaned forward to get a better view, suddenly understanding that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple service mishap. Chen's reaction to Patricia's identification was telling. Instead of showing concern about federal oversight or attempting to provide appropriate medical care, she doubled down on her aggressive stance, apparently believing that her union protection would shield her from any serious consequences. "I don't care who you claim to be," Chen retorted, her voice rising as stress and desperation began to crack her professional facade. You have no authority on this aircraft. I am the senior flight attendant, and I'm telling you to sit down and stop interfering with my investigation of this passenger's violent behavior." Patricia's response was to activate her phone's speaker function and play back the audio of Chen's false report to the captain, her own voice clear and calm as she exposed each lie in real time. The recording captured Chen's admission that she planned to cool him off by spilling coffee, providing undeniable evidence of premeditated assault. The sound of her own words coming from Patricia's phone seemed to trigger something in Chen, a realization that her carefully constructed narrative was collapsing in real time. But instead of backing down or attempting damage control, she escalated even further, apparently believing that aggressive authority could still save her career. "That recording is illegal," Chen declared, reaching for Patricia's phone as if she could somehow delete evidence of her own criminal behavior. "You cannot record crew members without permission." "I'm confiscating that device." Patricia stepped back smoothly, keeping the phone out of Chen's reach while maintaining her recording of the escalating confrontation. "Ma'am, you are now threatening a federal agent and attempting to destroy evidence of a crime. I strongly advise you to step back and provide medical assistance to that child immediately." But Chen had apparently crossed some internal threshold where rational thought no longer governed her actions. Perhaps it was the realization that her career was over, or the panic of being caught in multiple lies by a federal agent, but her next decision sealed her fate completely. "This whole thing is a setup," Chen announced loudly enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear. "That man is working with her to frame me. They planned this whole thing to get money from the airline. Look at him. Does he look like he belongs in first class? Does he look like someone who could afford these seats legitimately?" The racist implications of her words hung in the air like toxic gas, making even passengers who had initially supported her position recoil in shock. A successful black attorney traveling with his infant son was being accused of orchestrating his own child's assault for financial gain, the kind of conspiracy theory that could only emerge from a mind twisted by prejudice and desperation. Jerome looked up from ministering to his son, his face showing a mixture of pain and disbelief that anyone could be so callous about an injured baby. When he spoke, his voice carried the controlled fury of a man who had spent his career confronting exactly this kind of institutional racism. "Ma'am, my name is Jerome Washington. I'm a partner at Washington and Associates law firm in Detroit. My son is burned because you deliberately poured coffee on him, and now you're standing there lying about what happened while he needs medical attention. I want your name, your employee number, and I want the captain down here immediately." The identification of Jerome as a prominent attorney seemed to shake some passengers out of their passive observation mode. Several people began actively documenting the scene with their phones, creating multiple angles of evidence that would later prove crucial in legal proceedings. Chen's response to learning Jerome's profession was to laugh, a sound so inappropriate given the circumstances that it sent chills through everyone who heard it. "So you're a lawyer," she said with obvious contempt. "That explains everything. You people always think you can sue your way out of your own mistakes." The phrase "you people" landed like a slap, its meaning unmistakable to everyone present. Patricia's recording device captured not just the words, but the expressions of shock and disgust from other passengers as they realized they were witnessing not just assault, but racially motivated assault. "I've heard enough," announced the businessman from 1A, a man whose expensive suit and confident demeanor suggested significant personal authority. "Miss, I saw what happened. You deliberately spilled that coffee. This baby is injured because of your actions, not his father's." Other passengers began speaking up as well, their testimonies contradicting Chen's false narrative and providing additional witnesses to her crimes. But rather than acknowledging the mounting evidence against her, Chen seemed to retreat further into delusion and denial. "You're all lying," she declared, her voice taking on a shrill quality that suggested complete disconnection from reality. "This is a conspiracy to destroy my career. I've been flying for 22 years without incident. I don't make mistakes." As if to punctuate her denial of fallibility, Chen grabbed the communication handset again this time to provide an updated report to the captain that would later be used as additional evidence of her consciousness of guilt. "Captain, the situation has escalated. The passenger has now identified himself as an attorney and is trying to intimidate me with threats of lawsuits. I maintain that he caused this incident through his aggressive behavior, and I request that security be standing by when we land to arrest him for assault on a crew member." The false report was so brazenly dishonest that several passengers audibly gasped. Patricia's recording captured not just Chen's words, but the reactions of everyone around her, creating a comprehensive record of how authority could be abused when unchecked by accountability. But Chen's reign of terror was about to end because Captain Morrison was already reviewing the cockpit voice recordings that would expose her lies, and Patricia Evans was preparing to use her federal authority to ensure that justice would be served before the plane even reached Chicago. The wheels of Flight 847 touched down at Chicago O'Hare with the kind of jarring impact that suggested Captain Morrison was eager to get this nightmare flight on the ground as quickly as possible. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, the tension in the first-class cabin was so thick it seemed to have physical weight pressing down on passengers who had witnessed an incident that would likely haunt them for years. Jerome sat rigid in seat 4. His burned chest throbbing beneath his coffee-stained shirt, but his entire focus remained on Elijah, who had finally exhausted himself into whimpering silence. The baby's left arm was wrapped in makeshift bandages created from cloth napkins and cool water bottles provided by sympathetic passengers, but Jerome could see the angry red burns that would require immediate medical attention. Victoria Chen stood near the cabin door like a general preparing to accept a surrender, her uniform straightened and her expression set in lines of righteous vindication. She had spent the final hour of the flight preparing her story, refining her lies, and apparently convincing herself that her version of events would prevail over the testimony of federal agents and video evidence. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom with an announcement that sent ice through the veins of anyone who understood what was really happening. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We have law enforcement boarding the aircraft to address a security situation. Please stay calm and cooperate with the officers." Patricia Evans closed her book and placed it carefully in her carry-on bag, her movements deliberate and controlled as she prepared for what she knew would be a crucial confrontation. Her federal credentials were ready. Her recording device was still active, and her 20 years of law enforcement experience had taught her exactly how these situations typically unfolded when officers arrived expecting to find one version of events, but discovered something entirely different. The cabin door opened with a mechanical hiss, followed immediately by the sound of heavy footsteps on the jet bridge. 3 Chicago police officers entered the aircraft, their presence commanding immediate attention from every passenger. They wore the grim expressions of professionals responding to a reported assault, their hands resting near their equipment belts as they scanned the cabin for signs of trouble. Leading the group was Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, a 15-year veteran whose experience with airport incidents had taught him to approach every situation with healthy skepticism about initial reports. Behind him came officers Jennifer Walsh and David Kim, both younger but equally professional in their bearing as they followed Rodriguez down the narrow aisle toward first class. Chen stepped forward immediately, pointing directly at Jerome with the kind of theatrical gesture that suggested she had rehearsed this moment during the flight. "Officers, that's him in 4A, Jerome Washington. He assaulted me with the beverage cart and endangered his own child. I've been flying for 22 years, and I've never experienced anything like this." Sergeant Rodriguez nodded acknowledgement to Chen while his trained eyes swept the scene, taking in details that would inform his assessment of the situation. He noticed the coffee stains on Jerome's shirt, the makeshift bandages on the baby's arm, the recording devices visible in several passengers' hands, and most importantly, the calm, controlled demeanor of the supposed perpetrator, versus the agitated, almost manic energy radiating from the accusing crew member. "Sir, I need you to remain seated while we sort this out," Rodriguez said to Jerome, his tone professional but not hostile. "Can you tell me your name and what happened here?" Jerome looked up from his son, his voice steady despite the pain and exhaustion evident in his face. "My name is Jerome Washington. I'm an attorney from Detroit." This flight attendant deliberately poured scalding coffee on my 6-month-old son during beverage service. He has second-degree burns that need immediate medical attention. The simplicity and directness of Jerome's statement contrasted sharply with Chen's dramatic accusations, and Rodriguez noticed the difference immediately. In his experience, guilty parties tended to over-explain while victims stated facts clearly and requested appropriate help for their injuries. "That's a lie," Chen interjected before Rodriguez could respond. "He grabbed the cart and caused the spill himself. Then he threatened me when I tried to help. I want him arrested for assault and endangering his child." Rodriguez raised his hand for silence. His attention now focused on the other passengers who were clearly eager to provide their own accounts of what had transpired. But before he could begin taking statements, Patricia Evans rose from seat 4B and approached him with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to law enforcement situations. "Sergeant, I'm Special Agent Patricia Evans, Federal Aviation Administration," Patricia said, displaying her credentials while simultaneously activating her phone's video playback function. "I witnessed this entire incident and have it recorded. This flight attendant deliberately assaulted this passenger's infant and then filed false reports to cover up her crime." The revelation that a federal agent had been on board and witnessed everything changed the entire dynamic of the situation. Rodriguez examined Patricia's credentials carefully before accepting her phone and reviewing the recorded evidence that would completely demolish Chen's false narrative. The video was damning beyond any possible dispute. It showed Chen's deliberate targeting of Jerome's family, her aggressive pouring technique that ensured the coffee would miss its intended destination, and most crucially, her complete lack of concern for the injured baby afterward. But perhaps even more incriminating was the audio recording of her premeditated threat to cool him off with spilled coffee. Rodriguez watched the recording twice before handing the phone back to Patricia, his expression shifting from professional neutrality to barely contained disgust as he turned to face Chen. "Ma'am, based on this evidence, you are under arrest for assault and filing false police reports." Chen's face went through a rapid sequence of expressions: confusion, disbelief, fear, and finally, desperate anger as she realized her carefully constructed lies had been exposed by irrefutable evidence. "That recording is fake," she screamed, her voice rising to a pitch that caused several passengers to wince. "She's working with him. This is all a setup." Rodriguez had heard similar claims from other suspects caught on video, committing crimes, and his response was to signal Officers Walsh and Kim to move into position for an arrest that was now inevitable. But Chen wasn't finished with her public breakdown. "You can't arrest me," she continued, backing toward the galley as if she could somehow escape the consequences of her actions. "I have union representation. I have rights." This passenger was disruptive from the moment he boarded. Ask anyone. But when Rodriguez did ask other passengers for their accounts, every single testimony contradicted Chen's version of events. The businessman in one, A, described Chen's hostile treatment of Jerome from the beginning. The elderly couple in 2C confirmed that the baby had been quiet except for normal crying during takeoff. Even passengers who had initially seemed sympathetic to Chen's position now provided statements that supported the assault charges. The weight of evidence was so overwhelming that Chen's protests became increasingly disconnected from reality. As Officer Walsh approached with handcuffs, Chen made one final desperate attempt to avoid accountability. "This is discrimination," she shouted, her voice echoing through the cabin. "I'm being arrested because I'm Asian, and he's black. This is reverse racism." The accusation was so absurd given the circumstances that several passengers actually laughed, but Rodriguez maintained his professional composure as he read Chen her rights. The irony of a woman who had just committed a racially motivated assault claiming to be the victim of discrimination was lost on no one present. As the handcuffs clicked into place around Chen's wrists, her demeanor suddenly changed from defiant anger to self-pitying tears. "Please don't do this," she pleaded, apparently finally understanding that her career and freedom were both in jeopardy. "I have a daughter. I need this job. It was just an accident." But the time for claiming accident had passed when the recording revealed her premeditated intent to harm Jerome. Rodriguez escorted Chen off the aircraft while paramedics rushed on board to treat Elijah's burns, finally providing the medical attention that should have been administered immediately after the assault. Jerome watched his son's attackers being led away in handcuffs, but instead of satisfaction, he felt only exhaustion and concern for Elijah's recovery. The real justice would come later in courtrooms where Chen's pattern of discrimination would be fully exposed and where changes would be implemented to prevent other families from suffering similar attacks. Patricia gathered her belongings and prepared to accompany the family to the hospital, knowing that her role as witness would continue throughout the legal proceedings that would follow. As federal inspector and eyewitness, she would ensure that this incident became a catalyst for industry-wide reforms rather than just another covered-up assault. Northwestern Memorial Hospital's pediatric emergency department had the kind of controlled chaos that comes with treating Chicago's most vulnerable patients around the clock. But when Jerome Washington arrived carrying his burned infant son accompanied by federal agents and followed by a swarm of media attention that was already building outside, the entire department shifted into crisis management mode. Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to the disgraced flight attendant, took one look at Elijah's injuries and immediately called for a specialized burn unit consultation. The 6-month-old baby's left arm and shoulder showed clear evidence of second-degree burns consistent with scalding liquid contact, the kind of injuries that required immediate aggressive treatment to prevent infection and minimize scarring. "We need to get him into a cooling bath immediately, doctor." Chen instructed her team, her voice calm but urgent, as she examined the makeshift bandages that had protected Elijah's wounds during the flight. "And I want photographs of these injuries from every angle before we begin treatment. This appears to be a deliberate assault case." Jerome sat in the pediatric treatment room watching his son receive care that should have been provided immediately after the assault, his own burned chest forgotten in his focus on Elijah's condition. The baby was exhausted and dehydrated from screaming, his tiny body trembling as medical staff worked to assess and treat his injuries with the kind of professional competence that had been completely absent from Chen's response. Patricia Evans stood nearby coordinating with her federal colleagues who were already en route to begin a full investigation of the incident. Her preliminary report had triggered immediate action from multiple agencies: the FAA, the FBI's Civil Rights Division, and the Department of Transportation's Inspector General Office. What had started as a routine undercover audit had become a federal case with implications far beyond a single flight attendant's criminal behavior. The first indication that this story was already exploding beyond their control came when Jerome's phone began buzzing with calls from reporters who had somehow obtained his contact information. Patricia's recording had been uploaded to federal servers within minutes of landing, but portions had already leaked to social media where they were spreading with the viral velocity that accompanies truly shocking content. "Mr. Washington." A young man in an expensive suit approached Jerome in the waiting area, his manner suggesting legal rather than medical business. "I'm David Morrison from Crawford Burke and Associates. We specialize in civil rights litigation, and we'd like to discuss representation." Jerome looked up from his phone, where he'd been declining interview requests from news outlets across the country. "I appreciate the offer, but I have my own firm. Washington and Associates handles our own cases." Morrison nodded respectfully but didn't leave. "I understand completely." but sir, with respect, this case is going to be bigger than anything you've handled before. Global Airways has unlimited legal resources, and they're going to come at you with everything they have. You might want to consider co-counsel with a firm that specializes in taking on major corporations." The suggestion stung because it contained enough truth to be unsettling. Jerome's firm was successful and respected, but they typically handled medical malpractice and smaller corporate negligence cases. Taking on a major airline in a case that was already attracting national attention would require resources and expertise that might stretch his practice beyond its capabilities. Before Jerome could respond, his phone rang with a call from his law partner, Marcus Caldwell, who had apparently been watching news coverage from Detroit. "Jerome, please tell me you and Elijah are okay," Marcus said without preamble. "This is all over the news. CNN is calling it a hate crime, and the airline's stock has dropped 12% in the past hour. We're at Northwestern Memorial. Elijah has second-degree burns, but the doctors say there shouldn't be permanent damage if we stay on top of treatment and infection prevention," Jerome replied, stepping away from Morrison to have a private conversation. "Marcus, I need you to start building a case file. This isn't just about what happened to us. It's about a pattern of discrimination that the airline has been covering up." Marcus was already ahead of him. "I've got 3 associates pulling every complaint filed against Global Airways in the past 5 years, and I'm reaching out to civil rights organizations for additional resources. Jerome, this could be the case that changes how airlines treat passengers permanently. But you're going to need help handling the media circus." The media circus was already building outside the hospital, where news vans from major networks were setting up for live broadcasts that would carry this story into homes across America. Patricia had warned Jerome that the leaked recording would generate significant public interest, but neither of them had anticipated the speed with which the story would dominate news cycles. Dr. Chen returned with an update on Elijah's condition that provided some relief amid the surrounding chaos. "The burns are painful but manageable," she reported, her voice gentle as she addressed Jerome's obvious exhaustion and stress. "We've treated the affected areas with specialized gels that should minimize scarring, and I'm prescribing antibiotics to prevent infection. He'll need follow-up care for several weeks, but children heal remarkably well from these injuries." Jerome felt some of the tension leave his shoulders for the first time since the assault, but his relief was immediately tempered by anger at the thought that his son's pain could have been completely prevented. Elijah's injuries were the result of deliberate cruelty, not accident or negligence, and Jerome was determined to ensure that Victoria Chen faced appropriate consequences for her actions. Patricia approached with news that the federal investigation was already yielding significant results. "Jerome, we've pulled Chen's personnel files, and what we found is disturbing," she said, keeping her voice low to avoid being overheard by the media representatives, who seemed to be everywhere. "She has 17 complaints in her file over the past 5 years, mostly involving discriminatory treatment of minority passengers. The airline has been settling these cases quietly and covering up a clear pattern of bias. The revelation that Chen's assault on Elijah was part of a larger pattern of discrimination added a new dimension to the case that would affect how it was prosecuted and litigated. This wasn't an isolated incident by a troubled employee. It was evidence of institutional failure to address known problems before they escalated to criminal assault. There's more," Patricia continued. "We found recordings of her conversations with other crew members where she bragged about putting uppity passengers in their place and making sure that certain people understood they didn't belong in first class. She's been using her position to systematically harass minority passengers for years." Jerome felt the familiar surge of righteous anger that had driven his legal career, but now it was personal in a way that his previous cases had never been. His son had been hurt because an airline had failed to address a known predator in their ranks, and that failure demanded not just individual accountability, but systemic change. As if summoned by Jerome's thoughts, his phone rang with a call from Harrison Cole Global Airways' chief legal counsel. The speed with which corporate damage control had mobilized suggested that the airline understood they were facing potential liability that could dwarf their previous settlement payments. "Mr. Washington, I'm Harrison Cole from Global Airways," the voice said with practiced sympathy. "First, let me express our sincere apologies for what happened to your son. We take these incidents very seriously, and we want to make this right immediately." Jerome activated his phone's speaker function so Patricia could hear the conversation, knowing that everything said would likely become evidence in future proceedings. "Mr. Cole, your employee deliberately assaulted my infant son. Making it right means ensuring she faces criminal charges and that your airline changes its policies to prevent future attacks." Cole's response revealed the standard corporate playbook for managing major incidents. "We absolutely agree that Ms. Chen's actions were unacceptable, and she has been terminated effective immediately. We're prepared to cover all medical expenses, provide compensation for pain and suffering, and offer additional considerations to resolve this matter privately." The offer of private resolution was exactly what Jerome had expected, but it also confirmed that Global Airways understood they were facing catastrophic legal exposure. A private settlement would include non-disclosure agreements that would prevent the public from learning about Chen's history and the airline's negligence in addressing it. "Mr. Cole, you should know that this conversation is being recorded and that I have no intention of signing any non-disclosure agreement," Jerome said firmly. "Your airline enabled a racist employee to assault passengers for years, and the public has a right to know about that failure. We'll be seeing you in court." Cole's tone shifted immediately from conciliatory to threatening, revealing the corporate mentality that prioritized protecting company interests over accepting responsibility for harm caused. "Mr. Washington, I understand you're upset, but I should warn you that litigation will be expensive and time-consuming. We have unlimited resources to defend ourselves and will pursue every possible avenue to minimize our exposure." Jerome smiled grimly at the threat, recognizing it as the same intimidation tactic that corporations used against victims who couldn't afford protracted legal battles. But Global Airways had made a fundamental miscalculation in targeting a successful civil rights attorney whose son had been injured. They had chosen exactly the wrong victim to threaten. "Mr. Cole, you just made my job easier," Jerome replied. "When that recording plays in court, the jury is going to understand exactly what kind of company they're dealing with. Thank you for making our case stronger." As Jerome ended the call, Patricia provided one final piece of information that would shape everything that followed. "Jerome, I should tell you that Chen posted bail an hour ago and immediately went on social media to claim she's the real victim here. She's trying to rally public support by claiming she was set up because she's Asian." The news that Chen was already attempting to manipulate public opinion confirmed Jerome's decision to take this case to trial rather than accepting any settlement offer. The only way to prevent future incidents was to expose the truth publicly and force genuine changes in airline policies and training. The conference room at Washington and Associates 3 weeks later felt like a war room preparing for the most important battle of Jerome's legal career. Charts covered every wall displaying Chen's complaint history, Global Airways settlement patterns, and the federal regulations that had been systematically ignored. The case had grown beyond a simple assault prosecution into a comprehensive civil rights action that would determine whether airlines could continue protecting discriminatory employees. Victoria Chen sat across the mahogany table, looking like a shadow of the woman who had wielded authority so cruelly on Flight 847. Her expensive attorney, paid for by the airline's insurance company, had clearly coached her to appear sympathetic and remorseful, but the performance was unconvincing to anyone who had heard her recorded threats and witnessed her behavior afterward. Jerome studied Chen's face as his partner Marcus presented evidence that would destroy any remaining credibility she might possess. The cockpit voice recordings were damning enough, capturing her premeditated plan to assault a passenger she deemed unworthy of first-class service. But the pattern evidence was even more devastating. 17 previous complaints, multiple settled lawsuits, and recorded conversations, proving that this assault was part of a deliberate campaign of harassment. "Ms. Chen, you've claimed this was an accident caused by turbulence," Jerome said when it was his turn to question her under oath. His voice was calm and professional, but everyone in the room could feel the controlled fury behind his words. "But we have your own voice on recording saying you were going to cool him off by spilling coffee." How do you explain that Chen's attorney objected immediately, claiming the recording was taken out of context, but the words were clear and unambiguous? Chen had threatened to assault Jerome before she actually did it, providing irrefutable evidence of premeditation that would support criminal charges and civil liability. I was frustrated. Chen mumbled, her carefully constructed remorse cracking under pressure. He was being difficult and his baby was crying. I just wanted him to understand that first class has standards. The admission that she had deliberately targeted Jerome because of his race and the presence of his infant son was exactly what Jerome needed to prove federal civil rights violations. Chen had essentially confessed to using her position of authority to punish passengers based on discriminatory criteria. Patricia Evans, testifying as both eyewitness and federal investigator, provided testimony that connected Chen's individual actions to broader patterns of discrimination within the airline industry. Her investigation had revealed that Global Airways had received hundreds of complaints about discriminatory treatment over the past decade, but had systematically covered them up through confidential settlements that protected abusive employees. This wasn't an isolated incident, Patricia testified, her voice carrying the weight of 20 years investigating transportation violations. Ms. Chen was enabled by an airline culture that valued crew authority over passenger safety and dignity. The company knew she was a problem and chose to protect her rather than the flying public. The airline's attorneys fought desperately to limit the scope of the case, arguing that Chen's actions were those of a rogue employee rather than evidence of systemic discrimination. But Jerome had documentation proving that Global Airways executives had been aware of Chen's complaint history and had specifically chosen to retain her, despite multiple warnings from the FAA. Global Airways received formal notification from federal inspectors 18 months ago that Ms. Chen was a potential liability. Jerome presented evidence that would prove corporate negligence. Instead of removing her from passenger service, they promoted her to senior flight attendant and gave her authority over premium cabin assignments. They knew she was dangerous and put her in position to cause exactly the kind of harm that happened to my son. The deposition continued for 6 hours, with Chen's story changing multiple times as each lie was exposed by documentary evidence and witness testimony. By the end, even her own attorneys seemed to understand that defending her actions was impossible, and that their only hope was to minimize damages through settlement negotiations. But Jerome had no intention of settling privately, despite offers that eventually reached $8 million. The money was significant, but it wouldn't prevent other families from experiencing what he and Elijah had endured. Only public accountability and court-ordered changes would force the airline industry to address discrimination seriously. Chen's final breakdown came when Jerome played recordings of her conversations with other crew members, captured by the same cockpit voice recorders that had preserved her threats against his family. In these conversations, Chen bragged about her ability to make minority passengers know their place and described various tactics for humiliating travelers who she felt didn't belong in premium seating. "I've worked for this airline for 22 years, Chen sobbed as the full weight of evidence destroyed her remaining credibility. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt. I was just trying to maintain order." Jerome looked at the woman who had deliberately burned his infant son and felt something unexpected. Not sympathy, but recognition of how institutional discrimination corrupted individuals who might otherwise be decent people. Chen had become a monster not because she was inherently evil, but because her employer had rewarded her cruelty and protected her from consequences. "Ms. Chen, my son still has scars from what you did to him," Jerome said quietly. "But the real tragedy is that Global Airways knew you were dangerous and chose to enable you rather than protect their passengers. You're going to face consequences for your actions, but the company that created you will face them too. The settlement agreement reached that afternoon included not just financial compensation, but comprehensive changes to airline policies, mandatory bias training for all crew members, and federal oversight of global airways complaint handling procedures. Chen agreed to surrender her flight credentials permanently and accept criminal charges that would result in probation and community service. As Jerome left the conference room, he felt the satisfaction of knowing that Elijah's suffering had resulted in protections for countless future passengers. The real victory wasn't the money or Chen's punishment. It was the systemic changes that would prevent other children from being hurt by discriminatory airline employees. The Cook County Courthouse on that crisp October morning buzzed with an energy that suggested something significant was about to unfold. Media trucks lined the street outside, their satellite dishes extended toward a sky that seemed appropriately gray for the day Victoria Chen would finally face the consequences of her actions. Inside Courtroom 4, 1-2 was packed beyond capacity with reporters, civil rights advocates, and ordinary citizens who had followed this case since the viral video first exposed the brutal assault on an innocent baby. Jerome Washington sat in the front row of the gallery, Elijah, now a thriving 10-month-old, who showed no signs of the trauma he'd endured, except for the faint silver scarring on his left arm that served as a permanent reminder of one woman's cruelty. The baby babbled happily on his father's lap, completely unaware that this courtroom proceeding would determine whether justice would be served for the attack that could have permanently disfigured him. Judge Maria Santos took the bench with the gravitas appropriate for a case that had captured national attention and sparked conversations about discrimination in the airline industry. A federal judge with 25 years of experience, Santos had reviewed every piece of evidence in the case against Victoria Chen and the comprehensive settlement agreement that Global Airways had been forced to accept after months of devastating revelations about their discriminatory practices. Chen sat at the defendant's table looking nothing like the authoritative flight attendant who had wielded her power so cruelly 6 months earlier. Her legal troubles had consumed her savings. Her career was permanently destroyed, and the public humiliation had left her isolated from former colleagues and friends who now saw association with her as career suicide. The woman who had once felt invincible in her uniform now appeared small and broken, finally understanding that actions have consequences even for people who believe themselves protected by institutional authority. Mrs. Chen, Judge Santos began, her voice carrying through the packed courtroom with unmistakable authority. You have pleaded guilty to assault in the second degree, filing false police reports, and federal civil rights violations. Before I impose sentence, the court will hear victim impact statements. Jerome rose to address the court, carrying Elijah in his arms as he approached the podium. The image of a successful black attorney holding his scarred infant son while confronting his child's attacker would become one of the defining moments of the case, a visual representation of dignity triumphing over hatred. Your Honor, my son was 6 months old when this defendant deliberately poured scalding coffee on him because she decided we didn't belong in first class. Jerome's voice was steady but filled with controlled emotion as he spoke. Elijah will carry physical scars from her assault for the rest of his life, but the deeper damage was to our faith in the institutions that are supposed to protect us when we travel. Jerome's statement wasn't just about Chen's individual actions, but about the airline culture that had enabled and protected her discriminatory behavior for years. The case had revealed that Global Airways had received hundreds of complaints about Chen's treatment of minority passengers, but had consistently chosen to shield her from consequences rather than protecting their customers. This case isn't just about one flight attendant's moment of cruelty. Jerome continued his legal training, evident in how he connected individual actions to broader patterns of discrimination. It's about an entire industry that has allowed bias and hatred to masquerade as customer service, that has protected employees who abuse their authority to harm passengers based on race, religion, and perceived social status. Patricia Evans also addressed the court, testifying as both eyewitness and federal inspector about the systematic nature of the problems her investigation had uncovered. Her undercover audit had revealed that Chen was not an isolated bad actor, but part of a culture of discrimination that pervaded multiple levels of airline operations, Your Honor. In my 20 years of investigating transportation violations, I have rarely seen such deliberate and premeditated assault on a passenger, Patricia testified. Ms. Chen didn't just attack this infant in a moment of anger. She planned the assault, executed it deliberately, and then attempted to cover it up through false police reports and victim intimidation. The federal investigation had ultimately expanded beyond Chen's individual crimes to encompass Global Airways' entire complaint handling system, revealing a pattern of covering up discrimination through confidential settlements that protected abusive employees while silencing their victims. The airline had been forced to accept court supervision of their hiring, training, and disciplinary procedures as part of the settlement agreement. Chen's attorney attempted to present mitigating factors, describing his client's difficult divorce and financial pressures as explanations for her behavior. But Judge Santos had clearly reviewed the evidence of Chen's long history of discriminatory conduct and wasn't swayed by arguments that personal problems justified assaulting an infant. Ms. Chen, the court has reviewed extensive evidence of your pattern of discriminatory behavior toward airline passengers over many years. Judge Santos said when it was time to impose sentence. Your assault on this infant was not a momentary lapse in judgment, but the culmination of years of using your authority to harm people you deemed unworthy of equal treatment. The sentence included 18 months in federal prison, 3 years of probation, and a permanent ban from working in the transportation industry. But perhaps more importantly, Chen was required to participate in a public education program about the consequences of discrimination, sharing her story as a cautionary tale for other transportation workers. The court hopes that your experience will serve as a deterrent to others who might be tempted to abuse their authority. Judge Santos continued. Discrimination is not just morally wrong, it is illegal and it will be prosecuted to the full extent of federal law. The civil settlement with Global Airways was announced simultaneously, requiring the airline to pay $12 million in damages to Jerome and Elijah while implementing comprehensive reforms to prevent future discrimination. The money was substantial, but the policy changes were even more significant. Mandatory bias training for all employees, federal oversight of complaint handling, and a victim compensation fund for passengers who had suffered discrimination in the past. Perhaps most importantly, the settlement required Global Airways to publicly acknowledge the systematic nature of the discrimination problems their company had enabled for years. The corporate apology wasn't just legal boilerplate, but a detailed admission of how they had failed their passengers and a commitment to fundamental change in their operations. As court adjourned and Chen was led away to begin her prison sentence, Jerome felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but it couldn't undo the trauma his son had endured or restore the trust that had been shattered by one woman's cruelty. The real victory was in the changes that would protect future passengers from experiencing what his family had suffered. Outside the courthouse, Jerome addressed the media crowd that had gathered to cover the conclusion of a case that had sparked national conversations about discrimination in the airline industry. His statement was brief but powerful, focusing not on revenge against Chen, but on the hope that this case would prevent other families from suffering similar attacks. Today's verdict sends a clear message that discrimination has consequences and that no one is above the law regardless of their position or authority, Jerome told the assembled reporters. My son will grow up in a world where airlines are required to treat all passengers with dignity and respect, and that gives meaning to what we've endured. The crowd of supporters who had gathered outside the courthouse included many families who had experienced their own incidents of airline discrimination but had never had the resources to fight back. Jerome's victory was their victory, too, proof that even powerful corporations could be held accountable when victims refused to remain silent. As Jerome carried Elijah away from the courthouse past the media trucks and through the crowd of supporters, He felt the satisfaction of knowing that his son's suffering had resulted in justice not just for their family, but for countless passengers who would travel more safely because of the changes this case had forced. 1 year after the assault that changed their lives forever, Jerome Washington stood at the window of his expanded law office watching planes climb into the Detroit sky from the nearby airport. His practice had grown exponentially since the Global Airways case with victims of transportation discrimination seeking his representation from across the country. The settlement money had allowed him to hire additional attorneys and support staff, but more importantly, it had given him the resources to take on cases that other firms might consider too risky or unprofitable. Elijah, now 18 months old, played happily on the carpet behind Jerome's desk, his vocabulary expanding daily to include words like airplane and justice that he'd absorbed from countless conversations about Daddy's work. The scars on his left arm had faded to thin silver lines that would probably disappear completely as he grew, but Jerome sometimes caught himself staring at them, remembering that terrible day when his baby's screams had filled an airplane cabin. The trauma had affected Jerome in ways he was still discovering. He found himself researching flight attendants' backgrounds before booking travel, choosing airlines based on their discrimination complaint histories rather than price or convenience. Trust, once broken by institutional betrayal, was difficult to rebuild even when policies had been reformed and oversight increased. But there had been positive changes too. The Washington and Associates office now included a civil rights division that specialized in transportation discrimination cases, providing free consultations for victims who might otherwise lack access to quality legal representation. Jerome's partnership with Patricia Evans had evolved into a comprehensive investigation service that helped identify patterns of discrimination across the airline industry. Daddy Plane. Elijah pointed excitedly at the window as another aircraft passed overhead, his enthusiasm for aviation apparently unaffected by his early traumatic experience. Jerome picked up his son and joined him at the window, watching the plane disappear into clouds that promised afternoon rain. "That's right, buddy. Maybe someday we'll fly on planes again," Jerome said, though he wasn't sure when he'd be ready to trust Elijah's safety to airline crews, even with all the reforms that had been implemented since their case. The intercom on Jerome's desk chimed with a call from his assistant. "Mr. Washington, there's a woman here who says she needs to speak with you about the Chen case. She doesn't have an appointment, but she seems quite upset." Jerome frowned, wondering what aspect of the case could still require attention more than a year after the settlement. Chen was serving her prison sentence. Global Airways had implemented all required reforms, and the civil litigation had been resolved to everyone's satisfaction, except perhaps the airline's insurance company. "Send her in." Jerome decided, setting Elijah down with his toys before taking his place behind the desk that had become a symbol of his commitment to fighting institutional discrimination. The woman who entered his office looked familiar, though Jerome couldn't immediately place her. She was perhaps 40 years old, professionally dressed, but with the tired eyes of someone carrying significant stress. Her nervous energy and hesitant manner suggested she was struggling with whatever had brought her to his office. "Mr. Washington, thank you for seeing me without an appointment. My name is Sarah Martinez. I was a flight attendant on your flight," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The junior attendant who wanted to help your baby but was stopped by her." Jerome remembered immediately the young woman who had tried to bring medical supplies but had been intimidated by Chen into backing down. He'd wondered occasionally what had happened to the crew members who had witnessed the assault but hadn't been directly involved in the incident. "Please have a seat," Jerome said gently, recognizing the signs of someone struggling with guilt and trauma from their failure to act during a crisis. "What can I do for you?" Sarah perched on the edge of her chair as if ready to flee at any moment. "I should have done more. When I saw that baby screaming and her refusing to help, I should have ignored her orders and gotten the medical kit anyway." I've been thinking about it every day since then." Jerome felt a wave of sympathy for this woman who had clearly been tormented by her inability to overcome institutional hierarchy in a moment when a child needed help. The airline industry's rigid authority structure had prevented her from following her instincts to provide medical aid, making her another victim of the same culture that had enabled Chen's cruelty. "Sarah, you were a junior employee in an industry that punishes crew members for disobeying senior staff," Jerome said with understanding. "What happened wasn't your fault. The system was designed to prevent you from helping, and that's what we've been working to change." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she described the guilt that had consumed her since the incident. "I quit Global Airways 3 months later. I couldn't work for a company that had protected her for so long while she hurt passengers. But I also couldn't forgive myself for not standing up to her when it mattered most." Jerome leaned forward, recognizing an opportunity to help heal one of the secondary victims of Chen's assault, while also gathering additional evidence for ongoing investigations. "Sarah, have you considered that your testimony about the airline's culture of intimidation could help other victims? We're still working with federal investigators to identify passengers who were harmed by Chen over the years." The suggestion seemed to lift some of the weight from Sarah's shoulders, offering her a chance to transform her guilt into positive action. "You mean I could help make sure this doesn't happen to other families?" "Exactly," Jerome confirmed. "Your perspective as a crew member who witnessed how the authority system prevented appropriate medical care could be valuable in reforming training programs and emergency procedures. You could help save lives by speaking honestly about what you observed." As Sarah left his office with contact information for Patricia Evans and a sense of purpose that had been missing since the incident, Jerome reflected on how trauma rippled outward to affect not just direct victims, but everyone connected to discriminatory acts. The airline industry's culture of absolute crew authority had created multiple victims on Flight 847. Elijah, who was burned, Jerome, who was humiliated, and Sarah, who was prevented from providing help she knew was needed. The reforms implemented after their case were designed to address exactly these cultural problems, creating protections for crew members who challenged discriminatory behavior and establishing clear protocols for medical emergencies that couldn't be overruled by senior staff members with personal agendas. Jerome's phone buzzed with a text message from Patricia Evans Chen denied parole today. Earliest possible release moved to next year. Board cited lack of remorse and continued denial of responsibility. The news that Chen remained unrepentant even after serving most of her sentence confirmed Jerome's decision to pursue public trial rather than private settlement. Some people could only learn accountability through consequences, and Chen apparently required the full force of the justice system to understand the gravity of her actions. As Jerome prepared to leave the office for dinner with Elijah, he felt grateful for the changes that had emerged from their traumatic experience. The airline industry was safer for all passengers because one woman's cruelty had finally been exposed and punished, and that knowledge made Elijah's scars meaningful rather than just painful reminders of injustice. 3 years had passed since Flight 847, and Jerome Washington stood before a packed auditorium at Howard University Law School, delivering the annual Civil Rights Achievement Lecture to an audience of students who would soon graduate to fight their own battles against discrimination and injustice. Elijah, now a precocious 4-year-old, sat in the front row next to his grandmother, occasionally waving at his father with the unselfconscious joy that made Jerome grateful every day for his son's resilience. The scar on Elijah's arm had faded to a barely visible line that he treated as a badge of honor rather than a source of shame, telling anyone who would listen about the time the mean lady hurt me, but Daddy made her go to jail. The child's ability to transform trauma into triumph had taught Jerome lessons about healing that no law school had ever covered. The case that brought many of you here today began with a simple premise, Jerome told the assembled students, his voice carrying the weight of experience earned through one of the most significant civil rights victories in recent transportation law. that every person, regardless of race or class, has the right to be treated with dignity when they travel. But what started as individual injustice became something much larger when we refused to accept that discrimination was normal. The audience included not just law students, but civil rights advocates, airline industry representatives, and federal regulators who had implemented the reforms that emerged from the case. The Washington versus Global Airways settlement had become a model for how transportation discrimination cases should be prosecuted, and Jerome's law firm had consulted on similar cases across the country. Patricia Evans, now Director of Passenger Rights Enforcement for the Department of Transportation, had traveled from Washington to join the lecture, adding federal perspective to Jerome's legal analysis. Their partnership had evolved into a comprehensive program that identified discriminatory patterns across the airline industry and provided resources for victims who might otherwise lack access to justice. The most important lesson from this case isn't about individual accountability, though that matters tremendously. Patricia addressed the audience with the authority of someone who had spent decades fighting institutional discrimination. It's about how systems can be changed when victims refuse to remain silent, and when evidence is preserved to document patterns of abuse. The recording Patricia had made during the flight had become required viewing in airline training programs across the country, a shocking example of how unconscious bias could escalate into criminal assault when unchecked by appropriate oversight. Flight attendants now underwent mandatory bias training that used Chen's actions as a cautionary tale about the consequences of letting personal prejudices affect professional behavior. Global Airways had emerged from the case as a dramatically different company with new leadership that prioritized passenger rights over crew authority and transparent complaint handling that prevented the kind of cover-ups that had protected Chen for so long. Their transformation had influenced industry-wide changes that made air travel safer and more dignified for all passengers. The question we faced Jerome continued his lecture was whether to accept a private settlement that would have silenced our story or pursue public accountability that might prevent other families from suffering what we endured. We chose transparency over money, and that choice has protected countless travelers who will never know their safety was purchased with our pain. A student in the audience raised her hand to ask about the personal costs of pursuing such a high-profile case. Mr. Washington, how did you balance seeking justice with protecting your son's privacy and your family's well-being? Jerome considered the question carefully, remembering the months of media attention and public scrutiny that had accompanied their fight for accountability. The hardest part wasn't the legal battle, or even the trauma of the assault itself. It was wondering whether exposing my son's suffering to public view was worth the changes it might achieve. But when I see videos of airline crew members treating all passengers with respect, when I hear from families who weren't discriminated against because policies had been reformed, I know we made the right choice. The lecture concluded with Jerome reading excerpts from letters he'd received from passengers who had benefited from the changes implemented after their case. Families who hadn't been separated during boarding because of their race, elderly passengers who received appropriate medical attention during emergencies, and children who weren't humiliated for crying during flights, all protected by policies that emerged from Elijah's suffering. Change is possible, Jerome told the graduating students who would soon begin their own careers fighting injustice. But it requires courage to confront systems that seem too powerful to challenge persistence to continue fighting when victory seems impossible, and most importantly, the willingness to transform personal pain into protection for others. As the audience gave Jerome a standing ovation, Elijah clapped enthusiastically from his front row seat, proud of his father without fully understanding why hundreds of people were cheering for them. The image of father and son sharing this moment of recognition would later appear in newspapers across the country, symbolizing how individual courage could create lasting change. After the lecture, Jerome and Elijah walked across the Howard campus, where Jerome had first learned to use law as a weapon against injustice. The trees were beginning to show autumn colors, and students hurried between classes with the energy of young people preparing to change the world. Daddy, when I grow up, I want to help people like you do." Elijah said, his small hand secure in his father's as they walked past the law library where Jerome had spent countless hours as a student. "You already do help people, buddy," Jerome replied, lifting his son onto his shoulders for a better view of the campus. "Every day that other children can travel safely because of what happened to you, you're making the world better." The legacy of Flight 847 extended far beyond one family's quest for justice. Victoria Chen's assault on an innocent baby had exposed a culture of discrimination that pervaded the airline industry, leading to reforms that protected millions of travelers. The case proved that individual courage could challenge institutional power, and that even the most painful experiences could be transformed into protection for others. Today, Elijah Washington is a thriving child whose faint scars remind everyone who sees them that justice is possible when good people refuse to remain silent. His father continues fighting discrimination cases across the country, ensuring that the lessons learned from one terrible flight continue protecting families everywhere. The sky, once a place of terror for the Washington family, has become a symbol of how high we can rise when we refuse to let hatred define our limits. If this powerful story of justice and transformation moved you, please give our channel a thumbs up to help us reach more viewers who need to hear these important messages. Subscribe to never miss our latest videos about real people fighting injustice and winning, and share this story with anyone who believes that standing up to discrimination can make a real difference. Together, we can ensure that stories like Elijah's continue inspiring positive change in our world.